Imagine stepping back 9,000 years. You're in this bustling sort of proto-city, and the social rules there. They might just flip everything you thought you knew about, well, about early human power.
Or picture this.
Yeah.
How whole ways of life, like farming, spread across continents. Was it just people moving? Or maybe something more subtle, ideas traveling? It's pretty surprising stuff.
Yeah, what if the biggest shifts in human history weren't quite like the standard textbook story? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into some, frankly, groundbreaking new research from the ancient world. We've got two recent studies, both just out in science. Well, one's also covered in life science. We're going to look at the social setup of a 9,000-year-old proto-city in Turkey, Çatalhöyük. And then we'll explore how Neolithic culture and people spread across the Aegean. It's fascinating.
Right. And our mission today really is to pull out the key nuggets, the most important bits from these dense scientific papers. We want to give you a shortcut, basically, to understanding what these findings mean for how we see our past, maybe even our present.
Exactly. We'll see how new tech, especially ancient DNA, is lighting up daily life and these huge migrations from millennia back, and really zeroes in on what stands out about these discoveries.
Okay, so Çatalhöyük first.
Let's do it. Çatalhöyük, it's in south-central Turkey, and it's remarkable.
It really is. Not just some small village. We're talking vast, like over 32 acres, built around 7100 BC. And get this, people lived there continuously for almost 1,000 years.
Incredible. And the features are unique too, right? The houses?
Yeah, the houses were entered from the roofs. No streets as we know them.
And they buried their dead.
Oh,
Where?
right.
Under the house floors.
Wow.
Plus, it's famous for this incredibly rich symbolism, vivid murals, and tons of these female figurines.
Okay, so those figurines, that's where the debate starts, isn't it?
That's exactly where it gets really interesting. For decades, this site was sort of ground zero for a big argument. James Mellart, who first excavated back in the early 60s, he saw all those female figurines and thought, aha.
Matriarch. That was his interpretation. A matriarchal society, maybe even mother goddess worship. He kind of linked it to the shift from foraging to farming cereals.
Okay, a strong female-led picture. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Not at all. Decades later, in the 90s, Ian Hodder from Stanford took over the dig. And his work suggested something, well, quite different. He argued it was largely egalitarian.
Egalitarian.
Yeah.
So men and women basically equal. No big social or economic differences.
That was his team's conclusion based on their evidence. So you had these two completely opposing views.
Based on the same site, the same kind of evidence, left a real puzzle for a long time.
Absolutely, a decades-long puzzle. But now we have DNA. This new study, just published in Science, seems to have finally put the debate to rest, or at least shifted it dramatically.
And this study involved?
Who is involved?
A big team, including evolutionary geneticist Mehmet Somel. And interestingly, Ian Hodder himself was also part of this research.
Oh, interesting. So Hodder revisited his earlier conclusions with this new tool. Seems like it. They analyzed ancient DNA from 131 skeletons, pulled from right under those house floors, dating from 7100 to 5800 BC.
Okay, the moment of truth. What did the DNA actually show about Çatalhöyük society? Mellart, Hodder, something else?
Well, it definitely provided some very clear answers. First finding, kinship. They managed to connect 109 of those individuals into family groups across 31 different buildings.
How closely related?
First-degree relatives, parents, children, siblings consistently buried in the same building.
Okay.
And second- and third-degree relatives, like aunts, uncles, cousins, often in buildings nearby.
So families, nuclear or extended, were definitely the core of the household structure. That feels intuitive.
Right. It confirms that households were based on kinship. But here's the kicker, the really unexpected part.
Yeah.
The intergenerational links, the connections through time in those house burials, they were primarily based on maternal lineages.
Maternal, so through the mother's side.
Exactly. As Mehmet Somel put it, and this is a quote, "It clearly shows that male-centered practices people have often documented in Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe were not universal."
Wow. So this makes Çatalhöyük the oldest known example of this.
It's now the oldest society where we have DNA evidence pointing to a female-centered social organization.
And there was more, right? Something about burial gifts.
Yes. Because they had DNA, they could determine the biological sex of infants and young children, usually impossible just from bones that young.
Right.
And what they found was, again, quoting Somel, the pattern of more burial gifts for female babies was also not something we were expecting.
More gifts for baby girls.
Oh.
That is significant. It suggests value, maybe status, right from birth.
It certainly points that way. An archaeologist not involved, Jens Notroff, called it the first systematic evidence of such a continuously matrilineally organized Neolithic community.
Matrilineally organized, but Somel preferred female-centered. Is there a difference?
There is a subtle but important one. Soma leans towards female-centered because he's being cautious. Matrilineal usually implies a formal system of descent, inheritance, maybe power, passed strictly through the female line. The DNA shows women were central, yes, especially in burial context and family structure, but proving a formal matrilineal system just from bones and DNA is a big leap.
Okay, so female-centered is a broader term focusing on the observable evidence of female prominence in social structure and ritual.
Precisely. It's a safer interpretation of the data they have right now.
It makes you think, though. There was another comment from Benjamin Arbuckle.
Right, the anthropologist in science.
He pointed out that if these DNA patterns were reversed, if it showed clear male lineage priority and more gifts for baby boys.
We'd probably jump straight to calling it patriarchal power structures without much hesitation.
Exactly. It raises that question. Why do we find it harder to imagine, or maybe accept, female-dominated or female-centered societies, even when the evidence points that way?
It does seem to be a persistent bias, perhaps, even in scholarship, despite, mounting evidence from different places and time.
Like where else? Are there other examples?
Yeah, the sources mentioned a couple. Ancient DNA from Celts suggests men might have married into powerful local female lineages.
Interesting.
And there's DNA from 4,500-year-old skeletons in Stone Age China that also suggests women likely held significant power.
So Tattletale isn't necessarily some bizarre outlier. It might be part of a much more diverse picture of early human social organization than we typically assume.
Absolutely. It forces us to reconsider those default assumptions about universal male dominance in the past. History was likely much more varied.
Okay, so Tattletale gives us this incredible window into the internal dynamics of one community. But what about the bigger picture? How did major changes like the whole invention and spread of farming actually happen across regions?
Right. That brings us to the second study. Shifting focus now to the broader Aegean region and this fundamental question. How did Neolithic lifeways farming, settled villages spread from the Fertile Crescent, where they largely originated, into Europe?
Through the Aegean, which is that area between modern Greece and Turkey.
Exactly. And for a long time, the mechanisms were, well, murky, partly because we lacked human ancient DNA from before the Neolithic in that specific area.
So this second study, also in science, tackled that head on.
It did. They looked at both population history, the genetics, and the cultural history.
How'd they do that? What was the approach?
They generated 30 new paleogenomes, ancient DNA profiles, including one really old one, a 10,000-year-old individual from West Anatolia, which is key. They combined that with over 400 previously published ancient genomes, so a massive genetic data set.
Okay, that covers the people side. What about culture?
They did something really cool there. They compiled this huge digital database of material culture, things like pottery styles, tool types, burial practices, 54 different cultural traits, documented across 16 key sites dating to around 9,000 years ago. And crucially, they linked this cultural data to 104 genomes from those same sites.
Wow, okay. So connecting the cultural artifacts directly to the genetics of the people who live there, that lets you ask some specific questions.
Precisely. They could reconstruct both human movement, mobility, and cultural change during that massive shift to farming the Neolithic transition.
And what did they find? Any surprises?
Quite a few, actually. First, looking back before farming really took off in West Anatolia, they found genetic continuity for at least 6,000 years. The local population stayed relatively stable genetically during the early Holocene.
6,000 years. But were they isolated?
Not culturally. During that time, these West Anatolians were definitely interacting with people to their east from the Fertile Crescent. They were exchanging ideas, maybe experimenting with settling down. But, and this is the key part, without significant genetic mixing.
So ideas were flowing, culture was being shared, but people weren't really intermarrying or moving in large numbers yet.
Seems that way initially. But then, things changed around 9,000 years ago. That's when you see the full-scale farming settlements really spreading.
And that involved people moving.
Yes, but not in the simple way some older models suggested, like a big wave of farmers completely replacing the local hunter-gatherers.
Okay, so what did happen?
The data points to more of a fusion. You had incoming groups, genetically distinct, arriving from the east, But instead of replacing the locals, they joined them. They genetically mix, that's called admixture, with the descendants of those long-term local foragers within the newly established farming villages.
Ah, so a mixing process created the first farmers in this area.
Exactly. And this mixing gave rise to that genetic profile we now call the Anatolian farmer. It's a foundational group for later European populations.
And that mixed group then spread.
Yes, that Anatolian farmer profile spread across the Aegean Sea and eventually far into Europe. Though interestingly, once in Europe, the amount of mixing with local European foragers seems to have been more limited, or at least more sporadic, than in Anatolia itself.
Okay, that's the genetic story. But what about the culture side? Did the cultural patterns match the genetic ones?
That's the really fascinating question they asked. They compared cultural similarities between those 16 Neolithic sites with the genetic similarities between the people living there.
The assumption might be that villages that are genetically similar would also be culturally similar, right? If people brought their culture with them as they moved and mixed.
That would be the expectation if culture just tracked migration. But that's not what they found.
No. What did they find?
After they accounted for geographic distance, obviously nearby villages tend to be more similar just because they're close. They found that cultural similarities correlated much more strongly with geographic proximity than with population genetic similarities.
Wait, so villages that were close to each other shared more cultural traits, regardless of whether their populations were closely related genetically.
Exactly. It strongly suggests, as the researchers put it, that ideas mixed faster than people in this region.
Ideas mixed faster than people. That's a powerful phrase.
It really is. It challenges that common assumption that a distinct culture, like a specific pottery style, represents a distinct genetically related group of people.
It's like that old archaeology saying,
Pots don't equal people. This study provides strong quantitative evidence supporting that adage, at least in this context. Culture and genetics weren't always traveling together.
so you could adopt new farming techniques, new ways of making tools or pots from your neighbors, even if you weren't directly related or intermarrying extensively with them.
Precisely. It paints a picture of the Neolithic transition as being driven by complex interactions, sometimes people moving and mixing, other times ideas and technology spreading through existing social networks, independent of large-scale migration.
It shows there wasn't just one way to become Neolithic. There were diverse paths. And the relationship between cultural change and genetic change was flexible, uncoupled, as they say.
That's a great way to put it, an uncoupling of cultural and genetic interactions.
So, quite a journey today. We've gone from deep inside the houses of Seth-Loic, discovering this potentially female-centered society 9,000 years ago,
Right, really challenging our assumptions about early social structures and power dynamics.
all the way out to the Aegean, seeing how farming spread not just through migration, but through this complex fusion and a surprisingly rapid flow of ideas, sometimes faster than the flow of genes.
Yeah, these studies are just fantastic examples of how new tools, like ancient DNA analysis, are constantly refining, sometimes overturning our understanding of the past. They reveal these incredible nuances in how people lived, organized themselves, migrated, and shared culture, things we just couldn't see clearly before.
So hopefully you listening now have those key nuggets of knowledge, the latest insights coming out of Neolithic Anatolia and the Aegean.
It's a glimpse into a past that's proving to be far more complex and, honestly, more interesting than we might have thought.
And it leaves us with a final thought, maybe. We saw in the ancient Aegean how ideas could travel faster than people, how culture and genetics could be uncoupled. How might that dynamic play out today? In our own hyper-connected world, where information travels instantly, yet societies can still feel quite fragmented, does that ancient pattern resonate somehow? What stands out to you from these discoveries about our deep past?